What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making a Doomsday switch. So this month my Patreons and I decided to have our first ever monthly challenge, and the topic chosen was Doomsday. So I hopped online looking around for something related to the theme, and I came across this image of a Doomsday switch. It's actually a small prop you can buy for your office desk, which I thought was pretty funny. But I love the idea of the small switch, and it definitely had Doomsday vibes. So I thought it would be a lot of fun to recreate for this monthly challenge. Now this prop was looking a little bit plain, and I wanted to add a few more elements to it, especially on the back. So I found a couple other images that I liked online, and I thought I would take parts of these that I thought looked interesting and incorporate them into the model. So like usual, I started off with a cube and started blocking out the main shape. I wanted to get the main elements out of the way and at least figure out where the main objects were placed. That way it would just help me figure out how everything else fit together. So I really wasn't focused on getting everything perfect right off the start. I didn't want to drag out this process any longer than it has to be, so we're just going to roughly get things into the scene and we can always refine them later on. And after I had the main rectangle and front cover blocked out, I decided to start on the front side with the switches. So I kept these pretty straightforward. I just inserted a cylinder, deleted those front faces, and started extruding that edge to give it roughly a shape of the switch that was in my reference photo. I didn't want to overcomplicate this, I wanted to keep it pretty straightforward, so we're just going to make a simple switch, and then once that's done I can duplicate it to create the other one that's just below it. I originally was thinking I was going to create this small little switch knob by adding in a cylinder, but then I realized there's a ball on the end, and I thought making it as one object instead of two would look a little bit better, so I quickly just inserted a sphere, select some of those faces and circularized it, and then extruded it outwards to create that knob sort of switch looking shape. And of course adding a nice large bevel on the end so it's nice and round. Alright, so next up was moving on to the key that sits on the bottom left corner. So I started off with a cylinder once again to create the bottom part that the key actually goes into. And that's pretty straightforward. I just scaled in one side to give it some shape, and then I use that multi-cut tool to start connecting some of those vertices so I can block out where I want the extrusion to be so my key can fit into it. Now I'm not going to make that extrusion right away. I want to make my key so I can figure out the size, and then we can come back and extrude those faces. Now I'm not going to lie, I didn't spend too long on this key since it's not going to be really in scene. You're only going to see the end of it that's sticking out. So all I do for this is simply add a plane into the scene, and I can add some edge loops and simply move around some vertices to give it roughly the shape of a key. And once everything's looking good, I can select all of those faces and extrude them to give it some depth, and then duplicate it to create the other side of the key and attach them together. And then I just have to position it over my small keyhole. And then finally in the top left corner is the small light, and that's pretty straightforward. I just added a small cylinder, beveled out those edges, and then added another cylinder behind it to act as some little metal frame that's holding it on. Alright, so next up was creating that large red button that sits right in the middle. Now of course there is that clear cover that sits over it, so what I'm going to do rather than just hiding that object to create the button, I'm actually going to keep it in the scene to help me visualize how everything is looking. So what I'm going to do is just add a random material. I decided to blend just to that clear cover, and I can make it a bit transparent to help me see through it. Once again, not worrying about this material at all, it's just to help me build all the objects around it, and then later on we can remove this material. So all I'm going to do here is add a few edge loops to block out the area that I want to extrude to create that depth where my button needs to live. And then add a few extra edge loops. Using that circularized tool, I can select that edge and turn it into a circle, and then I can extrude it once again to give it some more depth. And then I'm going to add a small cylinder that sits inside of that hole, which will be that red Doomsday button that you can press down. So next up we're creating those USB ports that sit on the top of this device. So I need to create some booleans to make some holes where those USB ports are going to live. So I need to insert a few cylinders, combine them into one object, and I can position those on the top of this device and boolean out some holes. Now once I do that boolean, I do need to go in afterwards with the target weld and multi-cut tool and clean up some of these vertices and attach them wherever I need them. And while I'm here, I'm also going to make a small extrusion right on the back. I like the idea of that little hard drive that was in my reference photo, so I thought it'd be cool to make one that sit right on the back of this device. I also really like the idea of those circled cutouts that the wires were coming out of, so I thought I would insert a small cylinder to create two little booleans where I can create some holes into the back of this device. And basically I'm going to follow the reference photo by creating some wires that can come out and attach somewhere below. And once again, once I create those booleans, I do need to go in with the target weld and multi-cut tool to clean up some of those vertices. And then I can extrude those edges to create some depth, and of course add a small bevel on the edge. And I'm also going to go through and bevel out the other main edges on this shape, as well as add some supporting edges wherever I need them. That way when I hit 3 on my keyboard and preview smooth, hopefully it can retain its shape and all those edges will look nice and smooth. Now topology wasn't a main concern of mine right now, so I'm not worried too much about my topology. I don't like to be too concerned about topology. It just allows me to create these shapes a little more freely, and I can always come in afterwards and clean things up. So while looking at my reference, another thing I really liked were the corners were extruded inwards and had some sort of little bolt or screw coming out of it. And I thought that'd be great to incorporate into this model. So what I'm going to do is select some of those faces that I created earlier from that bevel, and I can just delete those. Then I can select those edges and extrude them downwards and reattach them so there's a nice little indent or cutout in each corner. Alright, so next up I wanted to start adding some more objects to the scene. And in my reference photo in the very bottom there was those little green cube looking connectors, and I thought that would be great to add onto this model. So I'm going to start off with a small cube, and I can start blocking out a small little connector shape. And along with those connectors I wanted to create that hard drive that I was talking about earlier. And that's pretty straightforward just by inserting a cube, and I can scale that into roughly a rectangle hard drive looking shape, and I can fit it right into that slot that we created earlier in the model. Alright, so next up was just continuing to add small little connector or electronic pieces. I wanted some wires to go into this one, so I'm going to add a small cube into the scene, give it some shape, and I can just add that right on the back of this device. To be honest, I was really hoping to add more complex looking electronic pieces, but I really only have one day to get this model and UVs done, so we're gonna just simplify some of these shapes and we can always come back to them later if we have more time. So next up was adding those small screws that sit in those cutouts we made earlier in our device. So I'm gonna add a small cylinder, scale that down and fit that right where that cutout is. Now of course we can add that rivet detail directly into the material, and you don't have to necessarily add all those polys. However, you're always going to have better results, especially up close, if you can add that directly into the geometry. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to add a bunch of different edge loops. I can select those faces, extrude them outwards, and when I smooth it out, it's going to give it a nice rivet look and hopefully look like a small little screw. Alright, so next up I wanted to continue to add little bolts or screws on the back of this device. Not only just to make it look a little bit more interesting and more complex, but also act as a functional piece that helped keep these pieces together. So I thought it'd be cool to add one of those little screws that you see on the back of a lot of PCs. It's basically just like a small rounded screw. So we're going to insert a small cylinder into the scene. I'm going to scale that down and bevel out those edges to make it nice and round. Then I can delete those front faces. I can extrude those inwards, but I'm not going to actually merge them to the center. What I'm going to do is just select some of those edges so I can scale them to make them nice and flat, almost as if there's a little square screwdriver shape that I can then extrude that inwards to give it some depth. And of course add a small bevel to those edges so once I smooth it out, it looks nice and smooth. Now this time we're not going to add those small rivets around the outside. We're going to keep this a little bit lower in polys, and I'm going to add that detail directly into the materials later on in Substance Painter. Alright, so next up is moving on to those small wires that are on the back of this device. I wanted to start making some that come out of those 2 large holes that we created earlier. So I'm going to do this by creating an EP curve tool, and I can start drawing out the shape of the wire that I want. And then I can position those vertices directly into that hole so it looks like it's coming out and going somewhere underneath into those connectors we created earlier. And then I can turn that EP curve tool into a sweep mesh. Now this time I'm going to go under the distribution tab and I'm going to click on the distribute option, and this is going to turn my wire into a bunch of wires, and I can drag up that twist slider to have a nice twisting effect so it looks like a bunch of different wires are coming out of that hole. And then I'm going to duplicate that same curve tool we created over to the hole to the right of it, and following the exact same steps I can create another sweep mesh so I have more wires coming out of that hole as well. Alright, so next up was creating some small little zip ties. I was looking at the reference photo, and one of my favorite things about it was those small little white zip ties that were holding those wires together. I thought that would be a really cool idea to add into this model. So what I'm going to do is add a small cylinder and basically block out a very simplified twist tie. I don't want to get too into detail here since these things are very, very small. And then I can start positioning those in different areas on my wire. So all I do for this is just select some of my wire, and I use my soft select brush to scale in some of the wire so it looks like it's nice and tight around those areas where those twist ties are going to go. And then I can zoom in and just position those twist ties nice and tight around those wires where I scaled them inwards. That way it gives this illusion like those wires are nice and tight. So I basically just repeat the same process down the rest of the wire. So I'll choose random spots and I'll position those zip ties right where I scale in those wires. Alright, so next I wanted to add more wires going into my hard drive. So I need to add some sort of connector that these wires can go into. So I'm just going to create some sort of HDMI looking little cube shape that I can add on the end of my hard drive. Now I don't need to worry about the port. I'm just going to act as if there's some port behind it, but we can just fake that since you're not going to see it. Now I'm going to position these small little cube shapes on the end of my hard drive, and then similar to how I did the other wires, I can create an EP curve tool, draw out those points in the shape that I'm looking for, position them around these objects, and then turn them into a sweep mesh to create my small wire. And same goes for all the other small connectors on the back of this Doomsday switch. I created those 4 connectors on the top, so I'm just going to duplicate those to the bottom, and I can add more EP curve tools and sweep meshes to connect those 2 connectors together. I'm just going to intertwine these wires and loop them around each other. That way it looks a little bit more complex and it looks like these wires are all kind of tangled together on the side. Alright, so next up, you probably guessed it, more connectors. I wanted more wires and more connecting pieces. Like I said, I could keep going for hours and hours and add more complex shapes, but we are slowly running out of time. But I definitely wanted to add another connector to the scene. Now this one's going to be more like a VGA sort of style. Once again, not modeling it after anything specific. I'm just winging this one. So we're just going to add another cube and roughly block out a connector shape and add more EP curve tools and sweep meshes to add a few more wires. Alright, so next up we need to add a USB cable for those USB ports that we made on the top of this device. Now luckily this is a pretty straightforward shape, so we're going to create a cube and I can roughly block out what a USB cable looks like. And once I'm happy with the shape, once again I can add an EP curve tool, draw out the shape of the wire, and then I can turn that into a sweep mesh to create the wire shape. Now I realized on the very front of this Doomsday device, I had no holes or cutouts where that see-through lid is. So basically if you look at the reference photo, there's some holes where the hinges are, so when you lift up this lid it has an area that it can move. Now I could have simplified this shape by not adding any cutouts. I could just add like a horizontal cylinder to act as some sort of hinge that's attached to this clear lid. But I did want to make it like my reference photo, and I also thought it would make it look a bit more interesting as well. So what we're going to do is go on the front face of this device. I can move around these edge loops so I can basically create some squares where I want those cutouts to be, and I can simply just extrude those inwards. Now once again, I'm not focusing on topology too much. I just want to basically get all these forms into shape, and then I can always clean it up afterwards. Now that may not be the best advice for new artists or new 3D artists working with Maya, because you can really quickly dig yourself a hole that's hard to get out of because your geometry is just a disaster, and cleaning it up can make it extremely confusing. So approach this with caution. This is just how I like to work, but it is always nice to keep your shapes nice and clean as you're working with them. So figure out what works best for you and always try to have clean topology in the end. Alright, so now that we have some cutouts for our see-through lid, it's time to add some more small electrical components. Now in this reference photo, I really liked all those gold, small little metal pieces you see, and I wanted to somehow incorporate something along these lines into this model. So what I'm going to do is just start inserting some small cubes and small cylinders to act as those little tiny electrical metal components, and then we can just make a nice copper effect later on in Substance Painter and apply that texture to these little tiny objects. Now this is definitely one of the areas that I wish I spent more time adding tiny little details like this. I feel like if you just filled up the back of this panel with more of these tiny little shapes, it would look more complex and more interesting to the eye to look at least in my opinion. However, I didn't have too much time left, and I really quickly wanted to wrap up this model because we did have a bunch of UVs to do. So what I'm going to do is just simplify some of these shapes by adding some simple cubes and cylinders, and we can fill up the back with those little tiny components. So one of the things I liked most about this reference photo was that AA battery, and when I saw this image online, I knew that was definitely one component I wanted to add into my Doomsday device. And the more I think about it, we do need some sort of power source to make this whole Doomsday device functional. I was actually originally thinking of adding a cord that just kind of went off screen or just dangled off the end, but I thought it would be kind of funny if a AA battery powered something that would possibly wipe out the whole world. So I decided to go with this AA battery. So we're going to insert a small cylinder, and I can start blocking out that AA battery. Now once again, it would be really cool to add more complex components here to see how it actually attaches and how it functions. But we're going to simplify these shapes and simply attach it on the back of this panel. So the back of this device was still looking a little bit plain to me, and I thought we can help give it a bit more shape. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add a few extra shapes into the scene to hopefully make it look a little bit more interesting. So while looking at my reference photo, trying to decide what other small shapes I can add to make it more interesting, I realized I missed those big straps that help hold this hard drive in place. And not only was it a functional piece, but it also helped make it look more interesting. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna just duplicate some of those screws down, and I can add an EP curve tool like all the others, and I can turn that into a sweep mesh to act as some sort of small wire that's helping hold this hard drive. Alright, and I was just about to wrap up the modeling and I realized there's two small details I wanted to add. One of them was on the front, so the key was looking a little bit plain, and I thought it'd be cool to add some sort of small key ring that was attached to the end of the key. So I'm going to add a torus, decrease those subdivisions so it's very low, like a blocked out cylinder. And then I can scale that nice and thin as some sort of little key ring shape. Now most little key rings have two loops, so what we're going to do is duplicate this over, slide it very tightly close together, and I can combine them into one mesh, delete those faces, and reattach them so it looks like a little small key ring. And once that key ring is looking good, I can position it on the back of my key so it looks like it's attached to the small loop. And the other small detail I wanted to add were just the inside of these USB ports. So if I was looking on top of this device, it just looked plain, like simple cutouts, and normal USB ports would have some sort of metal on the edge, along with that little rectangle that sits in the middle that the USB wire can actually plug into. So we're going to simplify these once again. I'm going to create a small cube, fit that in so it just sits nicely inside of that cutout, that Boolean shape that we created earlier. And then I can add another small rectangle directly in the middle to act as that little component that helps attach the wire or connect the two pieces. Once again, simplifying these shapes, you're actually not going to see into this port too much. It's just to help make it look a little bit more realistic. Alright, so here is our Doomsday switch in its finished form. So what I decided to do was add 3 different groups for the 3 different textures that were applied. So on the very first group and texture are all of those front components as well as this hard drive and the USB wire. Now the only reason why I added this hard drive is just I had extra space on this map and I thought I should just take advantage of that space, so I just combined some extra objects. But I was originally just going to add these front objects onto this texture group, but like I said, had the extra room to work with. So the other group and second texture is the whole body, the main body panel shape. I wanted just to keep this on its own since I was planning to have all of those little texts on the back, so I wanted it to take as much space up as it could so I can have nice detail in the letters and they wouldn't look too pixelated when they're really small. Alright, so the third group and texture is everything else in the scene, and that's basically all of the back components. Pretty straightforward. I just grouped these all together, and as you can see, these pink ones are just these that are mirrored over, just to help take up the same space. There's no reason to take up unnecessary room. And all of these bolts and everything are all taking up the same space as well. So I tried to duplicate the same space just to help not only when it came to textures, so these 2 switches, I would just texture one and they would both be textured, but like I said, save as much space as I can so I can have more resolution in some of these materials. But that's how I grouped together my Doomsday switch. So now we can export this and jump into Substance Painter and we can start texturing. Alright, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go ahead and bake out our textures. Alright, so we're going to start at the top of our texture set list, which are all of those front components. And I thought it would be great to start off with that clear cover, that way I can see the button underneath it and can help me texture all the objects around it. Now I'm not going to worry about getting these materials perfect and dialed in right off the start. I just want to fill in these empty meshes and it's going to help me figure out what textures I want to use on all the other objects. So we're going to start filling in these empty meshes with different smart materials, whatever I think is fitting, and then we can adjust them along the way. And don't forget, you do have to change your shader to alpha blending if you want to add an opacity and an emissive channel to your texture set list. And that's obviously going to allow you to add that emissiveness to your bright lights, and the transparency I added to that see-through plastic cover. Now, I'm sure a lot of you artists out there will admit that some days you're just on and some days you're off, or some days it's just easier to texture a model and some days it's just a little bit more difficult. And for some reason, when it came to texturing this, I was extremely indecisive. I just didn't know which direction I wanted to go, and when I applied certain smart materials, they were just all looking a little bit off, and I was unsatisfied with the majority of this texturing process. So you'll see while I go through all of the texturing, I just jumped back and forth a few times. I really wasn't sure which direction I wanted to go to, specifically when it came to the shell. I really liked the metal look that was in one of the reference photos, and I also liked the plastic dark look that was in others. And I was really torn which direction I wanted to go. And for some reason, I just didn't think about the fact that I could really incorporate both of them, and that's what I ended up doing at the very end. I decided to make the front panel more metal like the reference photo in that Doomsday switch, and I decided to make the back portion more plastic like the other reference photos. So I just wanted to make a note of that. This whole texturing process wasn't as straightforward as it usually is, and the whole reason is I just had to jump around a lot because I just didn't know what I wanted. And usually in those situations, that just means you have to continue going at it until you're eventually somewhat satisfied. I guess for being a monthly challenge, it actually was quite challenging, so that's good at least. So next was jumping to the second texture set, which was the front panel piece. And this is what I was talking about earlier. I really didn't know if I wanted it more metal looking or plastic looking. And there's this new really great material that's now comes with Substance Painter. It's just metal brushed. And it was exactly what I was looking for, and it was very similar to my reference photo. So that's what I use as my metal material. And I was also torn with choosing between the metal and this plastic used soft smart material that comes with Substance Painter as well. I love this plastic material. I use it all the time in a lot of my models, and I thought it looked cool as well. It definitely gave you different vibes comparing to the metal, and I was really torn between these two. So I decided to leave it as is and come back to it after and move on to the next texture set, which was all of those back components. So starting off with all of those wires, we're going to add different smart materials and start adding some colors to these wires. Now, I was using those Google images as reference to choose what colors, but I wasn't being too stuck on one idea. I more or less just wanted to fill up these empty meshes with color, and then we can come back to them after. So next up were those large green connectors that were on the bottom. And once again, I'm going to use a smart material and I can fill in those meshes. Now, I decided to go with green because I was in my reference, but once again, not being too stuck on the one idea, we can always come back. So next up was our small piece of tape. Now, I used a duct tape material that I found on the Substance Source website that I downloaded and added to my project, but you can use anything that you want to use as tape. I definitely like this duct tape a little bit too much. I probably use it more than I should in all of my models, but I thought it was fitting for this piece. Alright, so next up was our AA battery. So I jumped on Google Images and just found a graphic of a AA Duracell battery, and I dragged that into my project as a texture, and then I can paste this directly onto my UVs where my battery is. Now, my battery is definitely a little bit thicker than a real life AA battery is, so I'll have to mess around with this texture to make it work, but I ended up making it work in the end. So there was only a few other meshes that needed some materials, so those tiny little metal pieces as well as those connectors on the top right. So once again, we're going to go through our smart materials. I'm just going to choose some sort of smart material to fill them up, and then we can take a step back and see how everything's looking and start refining things from there. Alright, so at this point it was time to add some smaller details. So I wanted to add some more words onto this chipboard, similar to our reference photo. It had all these little numbers and words beside these little metal golden tiny pieces that were on the back of this device. So I'm just going to start filling in and writing in random stuff. So for all you tech savvy people out there or computer people, all of these aren't going to make sense, so don't come at me in the comments. But it was similar to what this reference photo was showing. So I wanted to add something like that into this model. Along with all those little words and numbers, I thought it'd be cool to add other little tiny gold circles that were imprinted. Similar to the reference photo, it had those little golden circles everywhere, and I thought it looked pretty interesting, and it could be also fitting into this model. So I'm going to add another fill layer, add another bronze goldy material, and I can start just stamping in some tiny little circles around this object. Along with those little imprinted golden circles, I'm going to add some outline boxes that I can circle around some of these components just to make it more interesting to look at. Variation is good so everything doesn't look too consistent and the same. Alright, so next it was time to start adding some details or some graphics to the front panel of this whole Doomsday switch. So what I decided to do was jump into Photoshop to create some simple alphas to create numbers 1 to 3 with little circles around them. And then I just used another alpha that actually comes with Substance. It's just a square shape. And then I can imprint that square around each of these switches as well as add those little alphas of those numbers I created. I was more or less just following that reference photo that I found online and I wanted to create something similar. And don't forget about adding your on and off labels so you know which is which so you don't accidentally blow up the world. Alright, so the front labels are looking much better. Now, if you look at the reference photo, the inside of this box was all black and it had a caution stripe pattern in a square. So I just jumped onto Google Images and I found a caution square photo that was very similar to that, brought it into Photoshop to create an alpha, and then I can drag that into my Substance project and I can stamp that caution striped pattern directly into that area. Once again, I was just following the reference photo at this point and I wanted to create something similar. Alright, so the textures are coming together. We're basically on the home stretch now, but I still wasn't completely satisfied, and to be honest, I thought I should just add a few extra details to hopefully make it look a little bit more interesting. Things were looking still a bit too plain for myself. So I decided to add a few small details like this small vent, which is just an alpha that I imprinted into this material. I decided to add a little PR initial for polyrendr on the top of the hard drive. And while I was there, I also decided to change the material of the inside of this hard drive. So I decided to go with a different smart material, this hexagon shape, that just gave it a little bit of a bump pattern that I thought made it more interesting rather than the plain materials that were everywhere around it. Sometimes I find if the materials are too consistent, it's really nice to throw something in there like this grid pattern that really helps change things up. And finally, I decided to add those little graphics, the skull and the caution labels on the top of the see-through glass. I did forget to do that earlier and it is in the reference, and I do think it's a really important piece not to miss. And it makes things just more interesting to look at. And I know I say that all the time, but that's really the goal, is just to make it interesting and fun to look at. So I thought this was definitely needed. So at this point, to be honest, I thought I was done all the textures, and as I stood back and looked at the model, I realized it was looking a bit too plain in certain areas on the very front. And when I looked at the reference photo, it had this small legend. I think it was just showing different lights, and I thought that was actually a really cool idea, but I didn't like the legend that they had, and I thought I should just recreate my own. So that's what I did. I decided to make 3 different states as if there's 3 different lights that would show. 1 red, 1 yellow, and 1 green. The red just showing power on, the yellow just in the standby mode, and the green, maybe it goes green after you press the button when everything's activated. So I quickly decided to draw up a small legend and put it right below that red light. And that's basically everything. At this point, I just jumped into the renderer to take a look and see how everything was looking. And I did end up jumping out a few times to tweak a few of the settings and adjust a few of the colors, but I was pretty happy with how everything turned out. But other than that, that's everything. That is the whole 3D modeling and texturing process that I did to create this Doomsday switch. Once again, I want to give a really big shout out to all of my Patrons who participated in this monthly challenge. And if you're interested in getting involved in future challenges, you can check out my Patreon page, which is linked in the description below. And all of these working files, along with a real-time video showing the full process, including all of the UVs, all of that will be uploaded to my Patreon page as well. So if you're interested in seeing any of that, you can find it in the link in the description below. Once again, thank you all for tuning into this week's video. Please consider subscribing to the channel, and I will catch you all in the next one.